Let's be clear, fossil fuels are not in fashion. Rather, they are being condemned. For example, many major governments around the world are launching new rules, regulations, and spending plans almost daily to drive the energy transition.
Japan's green ambition threatened the LNG market it helped to create. Japan's aggressive new plan to champion clean energy is shaking up the liquefied natural gas market. Biden's $2.25 trillion infrastructure plan will focus on green energy and decarbonization.
And as we have told you in several of the weekly newsletters that those of you who join us on Patreon receive each week, oil and gas industry investment is at a 15-year low.
Report warns global energy crisis looming without increasing oil and gas investment. Shortage could mean higher fuel prices, increased energy poverty, and rise in greenhouse gas levels. It's too late to avoid a major oil supply crisis. David Messler, an oil field veteran.
As it stands, we are now less than 30 years away from reaching the deadline set by many countries, including those belonging to the European Union, to achieve complete decarbonisation. One of those countries that has set 2050 as the year in which their air will be free of CO2 is South Korea, a country that is taking the task of designing and implementing a decarbonisation plan that is really feasible very seriously. And not only technically feasible, but also one that is easy on the wallet. And take note, because we are not just talking about any country. South Korea is an industrial powerhouse and the 7th largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world. Of the total polluting gases emitted, 85.6% come from the energy sector, energy that the Korean industrial muscle needs like the light of day. In fact, 55% of all energy consumed in South Korea is consumed by the industrial sector, the highest rate of all member countries belonging to the International Energy Agency. Another fact, 98% of South Korea's energy sector emissions are produced by burning fossil fuels. And no wonder. For example, in the case of electricity production, South Korea still produces almost 40% of its electricity today by burning coal, and another 27% using natural gas. This explains why, overall, if we take into account the energy sector and all other productive activities, such as transportation, South Korea's dependence on fossil fuels is one of the highest in the world. This is how South Korea's economic muscle works today, by burning fossil fuels. And of course, given such a scenario, achieving total decarbonisation of the country by 2050, well, I don't know. It seems almost a chimera, more a wish than a feasible option. Even more so, if we take into account that the current Moon government has also put nuclear energy in its sights. So the question we could all ask is, how on earth does South Korea intend to achieve its targets? What exactly does Moon Jae-in's government have in mind? Well, you know what? He recently presented a proposal with 3 different possible plans or strategies. Have you ever wondered if it is possible to produce energy with coal or natural gas without polluting? Well, although it may seem like science fiction, the idea exists, it is real, and it is already being worked on. At least, that's what Moon Jae-in's government claims. Listen up.
Moon Jae-in's energy dream.
South Korea wants to reduce its huge dependence on dirty energy and at the same time not cripple or punish its powerful industrial muscle, then the South Koreans are going to have to be resourceful. Precisely for this reason, the government, in addition to a multi-million-dollar strategy on all fronts, has also concretely presented 3 possible plans to adapt the energy sector to a zero-carbon scenario. 3 plans that now have to be debated. The first of these plans is for the country to continue using some of its coal and natural gas plants practically indefinitely, or at least until they are fully depreciated. To do so, they would employ a novel technique of carbon capture, storage, and use known as CCUS. Yes, I know what you're thinking. But Josh, really, where is the novelty if you talk to me about carbon capture? If that is already known and works elsewhere, please. Yes, you were right, but a very important detail is missing. So far, these techniques have not been used to capture pollutant emissions on a large scale. To be able to achieve this and make it viable would be in itself something new. And for example, according to estimates by the South Korean government, the use of this technique, along with the promotion of hydrogen, which we've already talked about on VisualPolitik, electric cars and renewable energy could allow them to eliminate more than 95% of their carbon emissions by 2050 without excessively punishing or compromising their industrial competitiveness. The second plan calls for completely abandoning coal as a generation fuel, but keeping liquefied natural gas as a flexible energy source to meet peak demand. Of course, the replacement of coal would be undertaken with green energies. And finally, the third plan would be the most stringent and costly. If it is adopted, the country would completely abandon the use of coal and natural gas by 2050. These energy sources would be replaced by renewable energy and green hydrogen. This plan would make it possible to achieve the so-called zero carbon scenario, but it would of course be the most expensive to implement. The curious thing about these three proposals is that, in all three, despite Moon Jae-in's mania for it, nuclear power will continue to play a prominent role. So, although the government's plans to gradually reduce its presence in the South Korean electricity mix, as there are several nearly new reactors, and even some currently under construction, nuclear power would not completely be eliminated until at least 2083. But back to the plans. Competitive demands have made the first plan the favourite. In other words, even in the zero carbon scenario, part of the electricity would still be produced with dirty energy. And the question is, what potential does this carbon capture technology really have? How does the South Korean government intend to convert energy generated by dirty fuels into clean energy? Could South Korea become a world leader in clean, non-renewable energy? Is there really an alternative? Well, listen up.
Underground storage.
South Korea could have a significant advantage over other countries in applying carbon capture and storage technology to power generation, a technique that in 2020 alone prevented the emission of 40 million tons of CO2 into the atmosphere worldwide, which may seem like a huge amount until you realize that around 35 billion tons of CO2 are emitted worldwide every year. Now, what are we talking about in the South Korean case? Well, take a look at this image for a moment. At first glance, it just looks like another gas platform, but underneath it hides the latest energy gamble of the South Korean government. The Donghae-1 gas field is located in the East Sea. This field will be decommissioned in 2022, and the idea would be to use the pipeline that runs from it to the east coast to transport polluting gases from coal and natural gas power plants. In this way, the South Korean government plans to use the empty underground space to inject the polluting gases emanating from electricity production into the old natural gas field. In addition, according to Kwon Yi-kyun, a professor of geoenvironmental science at Kongju National University, filling in greenhouse gases in the natural gas well that has already been extracted would improve the geological stability of the area. It's by no means the first time something like this has been proposed, but the South Korean project so far seems to be the most ambitious and feasible. According to estimates by South Korean experts in the field, the country could store some 400,000 tons of greenhouse gases per year underground in the Donghae-1 field by 2025. And this would just be the beginning. South Korea claims that by 2023 it will have, thanks to research already underway, the capacity to store annually 4 million tons of carbon captured on its continental shelf. Look at this map. The two red dots represent the two carbon capture facilities that are currently serving as pilot projects. These are Boryong, Kosol, and Hadong. In addition, next to them, there are two other potential locations where CO2 storage facilities are expected to be commissioned in the future. But wait a minute, let's not get ahead of ourselves, because what we haven't talked about yet is the money, the hard cash. Estimates suggest that capturing 1 ton of CO2 using existing technology would cost between $60 and $70 per ton. And of course, for this technology to be applicable to power generation, without South Koreans having to pay astronomical electricity bills, the cost per ton would have to be reduced to a maximum of $30, and that is still a long way off. Will South Korea manage to reduce CO2 storage costs enough to make this technique viable? Well, to achieve this, they are investing heavily in RDI, but of course nothing is clear as of today. What's more, despite everything, with today's plans and technology, we are still talking about marginal solutions, not a real alternative. After all, even if this plan succeeds, to meet the zero carbon strategy would mean that at least 90% of energy sources would need to be clean. So, having got to this point, I'm sure many of you are asking yourselves, well, Josh, what about nuclear power? Why are there so many plans that are little more than patches? That is a good question. Nuclear energy is an energy that does not emit CO2, that is cheap, and that, more importantly, South Koreans understand perfectly well. In fact, South Korea is one of the world's major nuclear powers, and it also has advanced local technology capable of developing, manufacturing, and even exporting third-generation nuclear reactors. So why turn their backs on the energy of atoms? Well, this is where the politics comes in again. Listen up.
Marginalized energy.
Have you heard of nuclear power moratoriums? Those of you who are watching us from some European countries will surely be familiar with the concept. In Spain, for example, it has been applied since 1994. A nuclear power moratorium literally means banning the construction of new nuclear power plants and reactors. Well, in the case of South Korea, there is no moratorium, but Moon Jae-in's government has been making plans to put an end to future nuclear power almost since it came to power.
2017. South Korea's President Moon says plans to exit nuclear power.
It's something that has unleashed a huge wave of controversy. Why? Well, because despite being located on a peninsula, South Korea is, in practice, an energy island. Bordered to the north by North Korea, and with the rest of the cardinal points facing the sea, South Koreans cannot import electricity from third countries. So they have to make sure they are completely self-sufficient. And not only that, they have to be self-sufficient and competitive. For precisely this reason, South Koreans' commitment to nuclear energy has historically been very important, to the point of it becoming the 5th country in the world after the United States, France, China, and Russia in terms of the number of nuclear reactors in service, 24 in total. Between them, they are capable of generating more than 23 gigawatts of electricity, accounting for around 26% of the national electricity mix. In addition, South Korea has the highest density of nuclear reactors in the world. That is, the highest number of reactors concentrated in the smallest space. We are talking about no less than 24 reactors spread over only 4 power plants. Nuclear power requires a large initial investment, but in return, it generates clean, cheap, and stable energy, which is a major advantage for countries like South Korea that depend on imports and fluctuating world energy market prices. In fact, price competitiveness and security of supply in stable conditions for companies have been 2 factors that have promoted the industrial and economic takeoff of South Korea for years. Despite this, the fear that the Fukushima disaster could be repeated in South Korea led Moon Jae-in to promise in his election campaign in 2017, when he was elected president, that he would work towards ending nuclear power. And of course, to many political and economic figures in the country, this seems like a whole lot of nonsense. In fact, the presidential election is coming up in 2022, and the Conservatives have a good chance of winning back the Blue House, the South Korean equivalent of the White House. And you know what? Their position on nuclear power is very, very different.
Nuclear phase-out plan emerging as key issue in upcoming presidential election. Mounting opposition to the government's nuclear phase-out policy has prompted presidential contenders from the opposition bloc to promise to restore the use of nuclear energy, highlighting the fact that it is the cheapest and cleanest alternative to fossil fuels in Korea, which relies entirely on imports to meet its petroleum needs.
In other words, despite all the plans, it is not unreasonable to think that, in the end, the South Koreans' answer to zero carbon will be more nuclear energy. As you can see, the rest of the options seem either very costly and uncertain, or directly unfeasible, no matter how much Moon Jae-in insists on the contrary. The question is, should governments once again embrace nuclear power as a realistic option for generating huge amounts of clean energy? You can leave us your answers in the comments. But before you do, take a look at this news story.
China is to start up the world's first uranium-free nuclear reactor. The Asian country will start testing its thorium and molten salt nuclear plant in September. This type of reactor is theoretically much safer than those currently in operation.
Yes, the Chinese are becoming the new leaders in nuclear technology. Now, if you found this video interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. All the best. See you next time.